everybody, I'm Robert Donovan. Welcome to this episode of Tradecraft Solutions. So you've sold off everything you could to apply it to debt principal, but it wasn't enough. You've tried every savings trick you know from here or elsewhere, and you still can't cover your minimum payments. You've been working 2 or more jobs so long you can't remember the last time you did anything but eat, go to work, come home, collapse into an uneasy and restless sleep, drag yourself out of bed, and do it all over again, but your minimum payments just keep growing. Chasing money has nearly become a religion. Begging to cover shifts at work and living with the dread of any drop in income or unexpected expenses has long since reduced living to a mere existence in the service of supporting your debts. And then one day you check your bank account balance to find that it is empty, garnished to cover missed payments, and the rent is due in 3 days. Given that your bank account doesn't nearly cover what you owe, you know this is going to happen again, and your paycheck at some point will probably be targeted next. Anxiety over how you're going to cover the rent with a zero bank balance competes with anger at having your account swept as you try to figure out how you'll cover the rent with no money in the bank. Now, you tried to work with your lenders. This is where the anger comes from. You showed them your tax returns. You showed them all the financial records and all the documentation that they asked for, but they always came back with a proposed payment $100 more per month than all that documentation showed you could afford, as if they were stringing you along, only to come along now and take your money. All the stress, harassment by bill collectors, constantly having to chase money with nothing to show for it, and now you're staring at zeros in your bank balance. You realize that whoever ordered that account swept has just made a big mistake. They have just made the idea of bankruptcy, which you might have been resisting for some time in favor of trying to work with your lenders, suddenly look way more attractive. Now, I'm not a bankruptcy attorney or a credit counselor, but I've lived through everything I just described. I'm here to tell you, it's going to be okay. The anticipation is far worse than the reality, and you need to tell that nagging voice of doubt in your head to shut the hell up and then go talk to a bankruptcy attorney. As a small business owner and currency trader, I should have known better. I had a teaching job, had a small network consulting business as a side hustle, and no debt. Then I let family ties override my business judgment and co-signed some big debts with my sister on a bed and breakfast which she was running in Alaska and which ultimately failed. I did every stupid thing I would have told anybody else not to do. I risked more than I could afford to lose. I didn't properly check her numbers and assumptions. I ignored the fact she'd already been in Chapter 13 once and that she'd asked my uncle for a loan and he'd turned her down. My plan was to stay in California until I finished a few network jobs that I was in the middle of, use that to get a little money together to come to Alaska, and then go up there, help run the business, and get a share of the profits. So I kept my expenses down, scrounged some additional consulting contracts, put away some money for the trip up north pretty consistently every month, figured another year or so, and I'd be ready for the move to Alaska. Then I woke up one day to discover my bank accounts were empty. My sister had been chronically shuffling debts around, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and the account had been swept to cover payments she had missed. I should, in retrospect, have declared bankruptcy right then, but I still believed we could work with the lenders and pull this out if we cut expenses. We scrapped the bed and breakfast shortly thereafter. We opened a dog boarding business, which, to my sister's credit, my sister built up and did pretty well with, but it just wasn't enough to carry the expenses for that business plus pay for all the accumulated debts. In late 2010, I went up to Alaska hoping to salvage the situation, but when I got a look at the books, in increasing frustration, I discovered my sister did not understand how compounding and debt worked at all. When all costs were properly accounted for, the business had basically been barely making money or losing money in most months. So I came back to San Diego in mid-2011 to find most of my former consulting clients had either left the state or gone out of business. Took a few years to build the client base back in the cash-strapped environment those few years after the crash. Finally had to throw in the towel and filed for bankruptcy at the end of 2015. If I had to do it over again, I would have declared bankruptcy right after that first account sweep and just been done with it. Would have saved me an immense amount of heartache and some serious cash. Bankruptcy, used in good faith, is nothing to fear or be ashamed of. Nobody in their right mind plans to go bankrupt. And if you've done all the stuff we talk about in this debt reduction series and you have made good faith efforts to pay your debts, you are not a deadbeat. You're simply not able to make enough money to cover your debts, and it happens. You are exactly why bankruptcy replaced debtor's prison. And you can be back to 640 or higher after a bankruptcy 2 to 3 years afterwards if you start reestablishing your credit immediately. More on that in a bit. To go through my bankruptcy just real quickly, if you're doing a simple bankruptcy, you can file for yourself, but with multiple names on multiple titles to multiple properties to multiple lenders, I decided I was just going to pay an attorney to make sure that I only had to go to court once and be done with it. You will need to pay the attorney in advance for what I hope are obvious reasons. In the U.S., you have to get credit counseling and take a financial education course before you file. The attorney just gave me a link to a website for that, along with a checklist of documents I needed to gather. The course was online. I finished it in around 30 minutes, did the credit counseling the next day, chose bankruptcy, and printed up a PDF certificate that documented that I did all of this, and then gathered all the other stuff on that checklist the attorney gave me over the course of the next few days. Went over them with my attorney, and as soon as I filed, all credit harassment stopped. I could use my bank accounts without fear of garnishment. In a bankruptcy, exempt asset rules vary from place to place. I will just tell you the specifics of my situation. At the time, I had moved into my RV to save money and to try to save money to pay the debts off, so I was living in my RV at the time, so I didn't have to worry about losing my house, and I didn't care about giving up the property in Alaska because I wasn't living there. My remaining assets, including the RV and my Forex account, were about little less than $8,000. That's well below the miscellaneous assets limit of $25,000 in California. My income was way below anything requiring a means test. I didn't even need to go to court to file. The lawyer handled all of it. 30 days after filing, there was a meeting of creditors. I went to that. No creditors showed up, which is the best possible kind of meeting of creditors. There were a bunch of people there that were also filing bankruptcy, and I basically just stated that I had not filed for bankruptcy in the last 8 years, that I was abandoning all the property in Alaska to the lenders so they could make back whatever they might still be owed, that I was living in my RV. Total time getting there, waiting for everybody else, waiting for them to get to me, about an hour total. 90 days later, all my debts were discharged. And I got to tell you, folks, I was walking 2 feet off the ground. I no longer had to worry about any of this crap. The thing everybody worries about with a bankruptcy, of course, is the long-term effect on your credit. I have told you all of this so that you will know that others have been there if you're thinking about bankruptcy and you're in that kind of situation. If having been there once, however, you go right back into debt after getting out of bankruptcy, I can't help you. Creditors know you can't declare bankruptcy again for 8 years, and there are list services that sell lists of recent bankruptcy filings to shady creditors. So immediately after you file, you will get reams of loan offers with really high interest rates from predatory lenders. Ignore these bloodsuckers. Contrary to what mindless consumer propaganda would have you believe, there is probably no need to race out and reestablish credit, and good reason to work on building up your savings first. Since rebuilding credit requires that you go into debt, which I didn't want to do just after getting out of bankruptcy, I was perfectly happy to live rent-free in my RV and stay debt-free for as long as possible, and therefore rebuilding my credit score has absolutely not been a priority with me until comparatively recently. But what can you expect if you are not in a situation quite as readily convenient as mine is? According to a LendingTree study of people who filed for bankruptcy who borrowed from LendingTree in 2018, first off, a 640 credit score is considered the minimum to be eligible for loans. 43% of those who file for bankruptcy have a score of 640 or higher within a year of getting out of bankruptcy. 65% have a score of 640 or higher within 2 years after a bankruptcy. 75% of those with a bankruptcy restore their credit scores to 640 or higher within 5 years. A handful of people manage to get their scores up to 740 within a year of filing. A $15,000 car loan will incur an extra $2,171 in borrowing costs if you do it less than a year after you get out of bankruptcy. But if you wait 2 or more years, those additional costs will drop from $2,171 to just $799 if you do it 2 or more years after bankruptcy. Borrowers 3 years after a bankruptcy who applied for a mortgage get APRs, that's annual percentage rates, that are just 19 basis points, that's 0.19% higher than those without a bankruptcy. It works out to about $16 per $100,000 borrowed. Mortgage borrowers with credit scores of 720 to 739 saw similar APRs to those who did not have a bankruptcy. So the bottom line is you're looking at about 2 to 3 years, or however long it takes you to get back to a 640 or higher credit score before borrowing costs will start to come down. Creditors want to lend to you. They don't want to keep you out of the market if you're not looking like you're being a problem. Most of these results, I should point out, do depend on knowing how to rebuild or establish good credit. Does not happen automatically. Given all of the above data, one of the best bankruptcy recovery tactics for someone just out of bankruptcy that I can recommend is, if you are able, I can think of few better plans than to spend a year or two living completely debt-free and learning or getting good at saving and investing. Saving is the key to more than just paying off debt. That first 2 years, I think it is important to know what it feels like not to depend on the approval of a banker. Saving enables you to invest. Investing enables you to increase your income independent of an employer on your terms. Greater income enables you to save and invest more and afford things without debt or with far less of it. Isn't it interesting that saving is the one thing that nobody, not the government, not the banks, not any of the merchants incessantly cajoling you to go into debt to buy their stuff, wants you to do? There is no better time to start doing this than right after bankruptcy while you're still used to living on less. Only now, instead of working your ass off to make everybody else rich, paying off debt, you'll be saving to invest and make yourself rich. Bankers are terrified that large numbers of people will figure this out. Banks are trillions in debt themselves. And so is corporate America. It's drowning in debt too. If you are one of these folks that really wants to hurt the bankers and really strike a blow against the capitalist edifices, pay your debts off fast and don't use debt anymore. You will bring the bankers to their knees. Debt is also useful for investing too, I realize that, but since getting into debt is really expensive after bankruptcy and you have to go into debt to rebuild your credit, in my opinion, you're far better off those first 2 years using them to get good at saving and investing. Once I got to the point where I was able to save regularly, which was right after the bankruptcy because my living expenses in the RV are so low, I built up a 3-month emergency fund to avoid the need to use as much debt, if any, in an emergency, and I have since built that out to 12 months just because it helps me sleep better at night. So once I had my emergency fund, I built up my Forex account to $5,000. That's my other side hustle. More on that in future episodes. Once that was done, my monthly savings went into the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF, symbol VTI. I advocate index investing for most people as your base. There's other stuff you can do around that, but I like index investing. That's just me. You may have something else. Other people like real estate. After all of this is in place and running smoothly, that's the time I would recommend you start thinking about reestablishing credit. Now, again, everyone's situation is going to be different. This may not work for everybody, but I think it should at least be one of the first things you consider. If it turns out you can't, then don't. But if you can, definitely worthwhile. The first step in reestablishing your credit is to understand what banks are looking for when you use your credit cards, and that will be the subject of the next episode. If you like this content and want to see more of it or want to support the channel, give us a comment, like, or subscribe. Click the bell icon to be notified of new uploads. If you want to watch this entire debt reduction series, click on the link in the top left hand of the screen. If you want to watch the entire Tradecraft Solutions playlist, click the link on the bottom left of the screen. These links are also in the description below. That third link is what YouTube thinks you should be watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Until then, may the balance of your day be awesome.